3 men appeared, but only one of them was expected. At the top of a mountain, forgotten by maps, where the wind cut through the skin and the silence felt heavier than the air itself, something impossible took place. In that very moment, the heavens didn't just shine, they opened. But why now? Why right there? Why out of all the men in biblical history, were Moses and Elijah the ones chosen for this encounter? And more intriguing still, what did Jesus need to hear just weeks before facing the cross? Today, you'll discover one of the most overlooked secrets of Jesus' transfiguration, a biblical mystery that once revealed changes everything we know about faith, suffering, and God's divine plan. The sun was already hiding behind the mountains when Jesus called Peter, James, and John, 3 disciples, 3 ordinary men who had no idea what they were about to witness. The path to the summit was steep. Loose stones challenged every step. The wind grew stronger as they climbed, and the cold of the altitude began stealing the warmth from their worn-out clothes. Every meter conquered felt like a battle against exhaustion and against doubt itself. Peter carried on his shoulders the weight of guilt for still not fully understanding what Jesus had said just days before. James, his heart pounding, struggled to control the fear that insisted on climbing alongside him. John, the youngest, walked in silence, his eyes fixed on Jesus, trying to grasp the reason for this sudden climb. Jesus himself walked with slow but steady steps. His gaze seemed distant, as if he carried an invisible burden that only he could feel. The thin air made even breathing difficult, and amidst that physical strain, the disciples' emotional fatigue weighed even heavier. Not long ago, Jesus had startled them by saying he would suffer, be rejected, and killed. Words that were hard to accept, but now, here they were, at the top of a mountain, as the twilight painted the sky with shades of gold and purple. Jesus stopped, looked up to the heavens, and as he did so many times, began to pray. For a moment, the wind ceased, as if nature itself was holding its breath. The atmosphere shifted. An unseen presence began to grow around them. The air became thicker, charged with something the disciples couldn't explain. There, at the very moment when Jesus' words rose to the heavens began to descend to the earth. And as the disciples struggled to understand what was happening, the first light, one that came neither from the sun nor any natural source, began to touch the face of Jesus. The transfiguration was about to begin, but the real mystery was yet to come. The silence on the mountain now felt heavier than ever. While Jesus remained kneeling in deep prayer, the disciples watched, trying to understand what he was saying, or why he seemed so distant, even while being so close. The face of Jesus, still without any supernatural glow, showed a weariness that was not physical, but spiritual. His shoulders slightly slumped, as if the weight of the entire future was there, pressing him from within. Peter struggled to keep his eyes open, but the mix of exhaustion and confusion was beginning to win. James crossed his arms, trying to stay warm, while John, with his hands clasped together, stared at the ground, fighting not to be overtaken by sleep. But what they couldn't see was the invisible conflict raging inside Jesus. Just a few days earlier, he had spoken with a firm voice that he would be rejected, would suffer, and would die. The disciples had heard it, but they hadn't understood. How could they? They still dreamed of an earthly kingdom, of a revolution against Rome, of visible victories. But Jesus, he knew what awaited him in Jerusalem. He knew about the abandonment, the pain, and the cross. And in that moment, with his knees buried into the cold earth, Jesus prayed not just for strength, but for clarity, for comfort, and for a direct confirmation from the Father. His prayer rose, but the silence around seemed to offer no reply. The heavens still held back their next move, but Jesus' eyes remained closed, like someone who knows they must keep going, even when everything feels empty. By then, the disciples had no idea what was going on in the Master's mind. There stood the Son of God, carrying alone the awareness that soon he would be betrayed, humiliated, and delivered into the most brutal suffering. The spiritual atmosphere of the mountain began to change. An invisible density filled the air. It was as though the heavens were on the verge of breaking their silence. Jesus took a deep breath, opened his eyes, and for a brief second looked toward the heavens with an expression that blended hope with resignation. His decision was already made, but the Father, in his mercy, had something prepared, something the Son did not yet know. But that was about to happen. If you've ever felt your faith falter, if your prayers rose but it seemed like heaven remained silent, know that even Jesus himself experienced that weight. If what's happening here has already touched your heart, leave your like right now and subscribe to the channel. That way, this message of faith and hope can reach even more people. Because what's about to happen is one of the greatest secrets in the Bible. While the Master still prayed, the spiritual atmosphere on that mountain began to vibrate, and the first visible sign, the first tear between heaven and earth, was already preparing to unfold. It happened suddenly, like lightning that didn't come from the sky, but from within Jesus himself. While he was still praying, a light began to emerge from his own body. At first, it was a faint glow, almost like the reflection of a distant flame, but within seconds, that light grew, took shape, and what the disciples saw, none of them would ever forget. The face of Jesus changed. It was no longer the weary face of a man carrying the weight of the world. Now, it was as if the sun itself was reflected there, a light so strong, so pure, that human eyes could barely withstand it. His garments, once simple and worn from the dust of the road, began to shine with an impossible white. It wasn't the white of dyed fabrics. It was a brilliance that seemed to carry within itself all the glory of heaven. It was what Matthew would later describe in chapter 17, verse 2, saying that the face of Jesus shone like the sun, and his clothes became as white as the light. The disciples, now fully awake, felt fear take hold of them. Peter's heart raced. James stepped back, raising his hand to shield his eyes. John trembled. It was as if the very presence of God had descended upon that mountain, and before they could even begin to grasp what they were seeing, two men appeared beside Jesus, out of nowhere. Without warning, without the sound of footsteps, without the stirring of wind, they simply were there. Moses, the deliverer of Israel, the man who received the law on stone tablets on Mount Sinai. Elijah, the fearless prophet who single-handedly faced hundreds of false prophets on Mount Carmel and was taken up to heaven in a whirlwind as described in the second book of Kings, chapter 2. Both now standing beside Jesus. The disciples' eyes widened. They recognized them, as if the Spirit of God himself had placed that understanding within them. But the burning question inside was unavoidable. Why these two? Why among all the men in biblical history, Moses and Elijah? The biblical mystery before them was deep and terrifying. Peter tried to open his mouth to say something, but the words wouldn't come. James was still on his knees, and John, with tear-filled eyes, just stared, unable to look away from that supernatural scene. Everything around them felt suspended. Time, wind, even the air itself, as if the mountain had been pulled out of reality for a few seconds and taken into a space where heaven and earth finally touched. The impossible was happening before their eyes. The Son of God in glory. Moses, the representative of the law. Elijah, the voice of the prophets. Three men, but only one with the glory of God flowing from the inside out. And deep down they all knew this was just the beginning. Because the true secret of this encounter was yet to be revealed. What the disciples witnessed next went beyond anything the human mind could comprehend. Jesus, in full glory, was speaking with Moses and Elijah. It wasn't a silent vision. It was a real dialogue, with audible words exchanged aloud. Heaven itself seemed to have descended to open a sacred council between the past, the present, and the future of salvation. The theme of that conversation was the most unexpected of all. Luke in chapter 9 and verse 31 would later record, they spoke about the departure Jesus was about to accomplish in Jerusalem. But the original term Luke used meant much more than just departure. The Greek word was exodus, and in that moment a deep echo rippled through biblical history. Moses, the leader who had commanded the first exodus, leading Israel out of slavery in Egypt, was now standing before Jesus, the promised deliverer who would bring about a new exodus. This time, leading all of humanity out of the slavery of sin. Elijah, the prophet, who symbolized all the messengers who had come before, stood there as a witness. The one who had faced kings and crowds to proclaim the day of the Lord now stood before him, confirming that the appointed time had finally arrived. The scene carried such profound theological weight that the disciples, even without grasping the full details, felt in their spirit that they were hearing something eternal. Moses represented the law, Elijah, the prophets, both pointing directly to Jesus. The conversation was intense. Words like suffering, Jerusalem, and fulfillment kept repeating. The short and solemn phrases sounded like declarations from a heavenly courtroom. This wasn't a casual farewell. It was a commissioning, a confirmation. The disciples, lying on the ground, trembled. Every cell in their bodies seemed to react to the weight of that revelation. The air around them grew heavier. The light grew stronger. And the overwhelming sense that they were witnessing one of the Bible's greatest secrets left them barely able to breathe. Jesus kept his gaze steady. Hearing from Moses and Elijah that everything was being fulfilled was the encouragement he needed before the way of suffering. These two men, living symbols of biblical history, were there to assure the Son that the plan was unfolding exactly as the Father had ordained. The same God who had spoken to Moses on Sinai, who had answered Elijah on Mount Carmel, was now uniting all times and all promises in the person of his beloved Son. Heaven wasn't just illuminating the mountain, it was declaring before human and celestial witnesses that the path to the cross was not a mistake. It was the very center of the divine plan. As the final words of the heavenly conversation echoed among the rocks, an even greater transformation was approaching. The temperature seemed to shift, the sound of the wind fell silent, and then a dense cloud began to descend, enveloping everything like a veil of glory, preparing for the voice that was about to silence all the prophets of the earth. The cloud began to descend like a living veil. This was no ordinary mist. It was a presence carrying the weight of eternity. The air around them grew thicker. The sounds of nature, the wind, distant noises, all were swallowed by that dense silence. The disciples looked toward the sky, and for the first time, they realized they were surrounded by the same glory that centuries earlier had filled Solomon's temple. Peter's feet began to tremble. James grabbed John's shoulder, trying to make sense of what was happening, but not a single word came from their mouths. The light that had once radiated from Jesus was now swallowed by that cloud of glory. It was as if God personally was descending to envelop that place. And then came the voice. Not a whisper, not a distant thunder, but a declaration so powerful it seemed to make the earth vibrate from within. Matthew, in chapter 17 and verse 5, would later record, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Listen to him." The sound penetrated their bones. Every word pierced the disciples' souls, as if the entire universe had paused just to hear it. Peter dropped to his knees immediately. John covered his face with his hands. James, his body bowed low, trembled as though every fiber of his being was about to unravel. They knew they were hearing the voice of God himself. This wasn't just a heavenly approval. It was a command, a redefinition of everything they thought they knew about faith, about the law, about the prophets. The Father's voice was declaring that from that moment on, all interpretations, all traditions, all the secrets of the Bible would now pass through the words of Jesus. It was a spiritual rupture, a turning point that would change the way the disciples and the entire world would understand God's will. Peter's mind raced. It was impossible to forget the texts he had heard since childhood in the synagogue. Stories of Moses, prophecies from Elijah, all of it seemed to converge there, before his eyes, and now, before his ears. The voice carried authority, but also an inexplicable tenderness, an invitation to trust, to listen, to follow. The physical impact was undeniable. The mountain seemed to tremble. The stones beneath their feet vibrated. The scent in the air changed, as though a mix of wet earth with something indescribably pure filled their lungs. The words echoed for long seconds, and then silence. But it wasn't an ordinary silence. It was a void filled with meaning, a pause where even their own thoughts seemed to stop, so that nothing within them would dare interrupt what God had just spoken. When the echo of the voice finally faded, the disciples still remained prostrate, unable to move a single muscle. The glory of the cloud still surrounded them, as a living reminder that they had just witnessed one of the greatest secrets in the Bible. And deep within each of them, a certainty began to grow. From that day forward, their lives would never be the same. The silence that followed the Father's voice was denser than any cloud. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was the suspension of everything. Time, space, even their own thoughts seemed frozen. The air, once charged with the glory of the divine presence, now felt thin, as though the world itself was learning to breathe again. The disciples, still lying face down on the ground, took a long time to open their eyes. The cold, rough stone floor became their only point of contact with reality. Their hands, which had been shielding their faces, now trembled, unable to hold their own weight. Fear still gripped every muscle. With effort, Peter lifted his head slightly. James rubbed his eyes, trying to confirm what he was seeing. John, with tears still clinging to his eyelashes, dared to look around. The glory that had blinded them moments earlier was gone. The cloud had dissipated, and there, only one figure remained standing, looking at them with a gaze full of deep compassion. Jesus, Moses, and Elijah had departed. The supernatural light that had once surrounded everything was now hidden, but there was something different about Jesus. Even without the celestial glow, he radiated a silent authority, a strength that didn't rely on light or on a thunderous voice. Matthew, in chapter 17 and verse 8, described with simplicity what they saw. And when they lifted up their eyes, they saw no one except Jesus. All of biblical history seemed to condense in that single moment. The promises made to Abraham, the law given to Moses, the fiery words of prophets like Elijah, all pointed to him. Now, before the frightened eyes of the disciples, only Jesus remained. It was as if heaven had orchestrated that entire scene just to engrave this truth deep into their souls. The Son is enough. Peter, still breathing heavily, struggled to grasp it all. He remembered the stories he had heard since childhood, of God meeting with men on mountaintops, but he had never imagined he would witness a moment like this. John, on the other hand, felt the spiritual weight of that revelation. The silence, the disappearance of the prophets, the remaining presence of Jesus, all of it formed a picture that would change his faith forever. The fear, slowly, began to turn into a kind of silent reverence. Their hearts, once pounding from shock, now beat with a new awareness. They were standing before the one who held the entire story of redemption within himself. And then, without saying a word, Jesus stepped closer. With a calm gesture, he reached out his hand, and with a gentle touch, encouraged each of them to stand. No speech was needed, Just his look said everything they needed to know. The echo of the Father's voice still vibrated inside each of them. But now they understood. It was no longer time to seek answers from other men, not even from the heroes of faith. The center of it all was Jesus. As the wind began to blow again, bringing back the sounds of nature, the disciples stayed there for one brief moment, just looking at him. They knew the next step would be to descend the mountain, but in that instant, what mattered was that only Jesus had remained. The moment to leave had come. Jesus took a deep breath, cast one last glance toward the heavens, as if storing within himself the final memories of that divine encounter. Then, with steady steps, he began descending the slope of the mountain. Behind him came Peter, James, and John, still carrying in their eyes the glow of the vision they had witnessed, and in their hearts the weight of a calling they didn't yet fully understand. The rocky ground felt harder now, the air colder. Each step was a mixture of fear, reverence, and confusion. No one dared to speak. The silence within them was the direct echo of what they had just heard, the Father's voice, the heavenly command, the disappearance of Moses and Elijah, and the certainty that, from that moment on, everything would be different. Images of the glory still danced in their memories. The light, the cloud, the voice, and the face of Jesus, first shining like the sun, and now once again human, simple, yet radiating an authority none of them dared to question. As they descended, the contrast grew clearer. Up there, they had caught a glimpse of heaven. Down here, the valley awaited, with its cries, its pain, and the multitudes desperate for hope. The biblical mystery lived right there, still pulsed with every breath the disciples took. They knew, without needing more words, that the path of the cross was already beginning to unfold. Peter fought the urge to ask questions, but honored the silence of Jesus. James, with clenched fists, tried to lock into memory every detail of what he had seen. John, his heart racing, understood that this was a defining moment, an invisible line separating everything they had lived before from what was yet to come. As they walked on, Jesus turned slightly, and with a low but firm voice made it clear they were not to tell anyone what they had seen until the Son of Man had risen from the dead. The words sounded strange, mysterious, like another layer of revelation, still waiting for the right time to be understood. The three looked at one another, carrying a secret no other man on earth knew, a treasure they would guard until the day when it all made sense. The mountain was already beginning to fade behind them. The valley grew closer with every step. Down below were the sick, the oppressed, the skeptics, and those longing for healing, both physical and spiritual. As they walked, a silent lesson followed them. God takes us to the mountains, not to leave us there, but to strengthen us for the valley. And now, I want to speak to you who've come this far, following this story. If this revelation has touched your faith, leave your comment right now. Tell us which part of this story stirred your heart the most. Share this video with someone who needs hope today, because God can use a simple message to transform an entire life. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bells, and leave your like, because the truth of the word cannot stop with you. The mountain was now behind them, but the journey with Jesus was only beginning.